We open on a question no one has fully answered in 1,200 years. Before the TV show, before the legend, before the songs and the sagas and the songs about the sagas, there was a man, or was there? His name appears in manuscripts written 200 years after his supposed death. Historians argue about him in hushed tones at conferences, and yet, half the world feels like they know him. Ragnar Lothbrok, legendary Viking king, Conqueror of Paris, Scourge of England, father of the most feared warriors in history. But here is the question that has haunted scholars for centuries. Did he ever exist at all? Tonight, we go looking for the real Ragnar Lothbrok, and what we find is stranger than the legend, more dangerous than the myth, and far more human than anyone ever told you. The 9th century, the age of iron and ice, Northern Europe is a world of warring kingdoms, fragile Christian empires, and from the north, something new, something that moves like a wave and hits like a hammer. The Vikings. Not a race, not a tribe, a way of life, a philosophy forged in the cold dark of the Arctic winter. And from somewhere inside that violent, brilliant, terrifying culture, a name rises above all others. Ragnar, the wanderer, the raider, the man they say laughed when thrown into a pit of venomous serpents. We'll return to that pit, but first, let's establish the problem with Ragnar Lothbrok. Here is the fundamental problem with Ragnar Lothbrok. The primary sources, the sagas, were written in Iceland between 1200 and 1400 AD. Ragnar supposedly died around 865. That's a gap of 300 to 500 years. Imagine writing about George Washington, using nothing but stories passed down orally since the 1500s. Historians Dr. Claire Downham of the University of Liverpool and Professor Neil Price of Uppsala University, two of the world's foremost Viking scholars, both acknowledge the same uncomfortable truth. Several men fused into one. That idea should stop you cold, because if true, it means Ragnar Lothbrok is not a person. He's a vessel, a container into which an entire age poured its fears and its glory. And yet, there is a man named Ragnar in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and he did raid Paris. So who was he really? The Old Norse sagas give us three main texts about Ragnar. The Ragnar's saga Lothbrokar, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. The tale of Ragnar's sons, known as the Ragnarssonarþatra, and references within the legendary Krakumal, the death song of Ragnar. Each paints a portrait, but the portraits don't always agree. In one saga, he is a Swedish king. In another, a Danish jarl. In one version, he has two famous wives, the shield maiden Lagertha and the enchanting Aslaug, said to be the daughter of the dragon-slaying hero Sigurd. In another, his wives are barely mentioned. The only thing every source agrees on is how he died. We'll come to the snake pit in lap 6. For now, let's anchor him in his world.
To understand Ragnar, you must understand what it meant to be Viking. The word itself, Vikingar, likely means one who waits in the cove, the raider, the ambush predator of the sea. And in 793 AD, the world got its first terrifying lesson.
Lindisfarne, the holy island off the northeast coast of England. A Christian monastery, a place of sacred manuscripts, of gentle monks, of prayer. On June 8, 793 AD, the monks looked out to sea and saw something that had no name in their language. Long, serpent-headed boats, moving impossibly fast. And then, Norse warriors on the beach. The monk Alcuin of York wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. Behold the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of God's priests." The Viking Age had begun. Ragnar Lothbrok is believed to have been born somewhere between 750 and 800 AD, meaning he grew up in this new era of Norse expansion. He didn't start it, he perfected it. What drove them? For centuries, the answer was simple: greed, barbarians seeking loot. But modern archaeology has shattered that simplistic view. The Viking expansion was driven by population pressure, climate opportunity, technological genius, and something else, something deeply cultural. The Norse religion. The world of Odin, Thor, Freya, and the Norns. A cosmology that did not fear death, it celebrated the warrior's death in battle. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where the bravest warriors were chosen by the Valkyries, the choosers of the dead, to feast and fight forever at Odin's table. Imagine believing, truly believing in the marrow of your bones, that dying in battle was not an end, it was a beginning. That the blood on your sword was a ticket to paradise. Now imagine fighting a man who believes that. Now imagine 10,000 of them crossing the sea toward your shores. This was the world that forged Ragnar. Not a world of cartoonish savages with horned helmets, a lie invented by 19th century romantics, by the way, but a world of sophisticated, seafaring, philosophically complex warriors who happened to be pointed at Europe like a spear. This man, Ragnar, would ride that spear to the very gates of Paris. We'll get there, but first we need to understand where he came from. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the most important documents in English history, written by monks who witnessed the Viking onslaught firsthand. And within its pages, a Viking leader named Ragnar begins to take shape. 845 AD. A fleet of 120 Viking longships sails up the Seine River in France. They reach Paris. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, assembles his army. He divides it, a catastrophic mistake, placing half on each riverbank. The Vikings do not divide. They attack one half, utterly destroy it, then hang 111 Frankish prisoners on an island in full view of the remaining army. Then a heavy, terrible silence. Charles the Bald, Holy Roman Emperor, grandson of Charlemagne, did the unthinkable. He paid them to leave. 7,000 pounds of silver, the first of many ransom payments that would define the Viking relationship with Europe. A policy called Danegeld, the Viking tax on civilization. The commander of those 120 ships? Many historians believe it was Ragnar himself, or at the very least, a figure the sagas built Ragnar from. But before Paris, England. The raids on England began in earnest in the 830s and 840s. Waves of Norse warriors descending on the coasts of Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex. Monasteries stripped, towns burned, populations enslaved. And here is where something fascinating emerges. A Viking commander appears in multiple Anglo-Saxon sources, not always by the name Ragnar, but with deeds that match the saga hero so closely, historians call him the Ragnar candidate. A Danish king, known for extraordinary tactical intelligence, for striking where least expected, for a particular cruelty toward his enemies that bordered on the theatrical, as if he were performing his violence for an audience. For history. Was he aware that people would be telling stories about him 1,000 years later? Some historians think so. Some Vikings may have quite consciously crafted their own legends. The sagas were their social media, their immortality. This theatricality, this sense of myth-making, becomes crucial when we reach the snake pit. Hold that thought. Everything you've been told about the Vikings, that they were primarily warriors, is only half the story, and Ragnar's saga contains a clue that reveals something profound. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok opens not with a raid, not with a battle. It opens with a young man named Ragnar, who is described explicitly as a farmer, a man who tends his land, who raises animals, who is tall, handsome, and industrious. This aligns perfectly with what archaeology now confirms about the Vikings. 90% of the Norse population never went on a single raid. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, poets. The raiding class was a minority. A dangerous, celebrated, glamorous minority, but a minority nonetheless. The saga describes young Ragnar setting a trap for a legendary serpent, a massive snake that had been guarding a chest of gold, growing enormous as it coiled around the treasure. Ragnar covers his clothes in pitch and sand, so the serpent's venom cannot penetrate. He kills it, claims the gold, wins the hand of the shield maiden Thora. Historians read this story as an origin myth, the classic hero overcoming a dragon, a universal archetype, but embedded in it is something real, the leather or hardened pitch armor that actual Norse warriors used as practical protection. The myth contains the man, the legend contains the history. The historical Viking was not one thing, not a berserker screaming at monastery doors. He was a husband, a father, a man who carved beautiful objects, who wrote poetry, who navigated by stars across open ocean with a technology we still don't fully understand. A man who founded cities, Dublin founded by Vikings, Kiev shaped by Vikings, Normandy, the land of the Northmen, given to Vikings by a desperate Frankish king. Ragnar Lothbrok, as the sagas tell it, embodied all of this. The farmer who could become a king, the father who became a legend, the man who stared at the horizon and did not see an obstacle. He saw a destination, and that ambition, that relentless hunger, is what makes the story of his two wives so important to understanding him. His first wife, Lagertha, if she existed, is one of the most remarkable figures in all of Norse legend. The Shield Maiden, the woman warrior, described in the Gesta Danorum by Saxo Grammaticus as a woman who had the courage of a man and who fought alongside Ragnar in battle with her hair flowing loose. Was she real? Almost certainly not, in the specific form the sagas describe. But she may represent something real, the evidence of women in Viking Age warrior graves. In 2017, a 10th century grave in Birka, Sweden, long assumed to be male because of its weapons, was confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to a woman. The female warrior was not merely a myth. After Lagertha came Aslaug, and with Aslaug came sons. Sons who would become arguably more historically significant than their father. We promised you the snake pit, and here it is. The moment the entire documentary has been building toward, because it is, arguably, the most important death in Viking history. According to the sagas, Ragnar Lothbrok's final raid was to England, not in his prime, but in old age, with only 2 ships. A force so small it seems reckless to the point of madness. Some scholars believe this was deliberate, a final test, a seeking of the warrior's death that would earn him Valhalla. He was captured by Alla, the king of Northumbria, a man who would soon bitterly regret every choice he made on that day. Then, the hiss of snakes. The sagas say that Alla threw Ragnar into a pit filled with venomous serpents, and that as the snakes bit him, As the venom coursed through his dying body, Ragnar laughed and sang. He sang his death song, the chronicle, a poem of extraordinary power, recounting his life, his battles, his pride, and ending with the words, "How the little pigs would grunt if they knew the situation of the old boar." A message to his sons, spoken through dying lips, venom stung in a pit of serpents. A final act of theatrical, mythological defiance. Now, did this happen? Historians are divided. The snake pit as described is almost certainly legend. But here is what may be true. A Viking leader of enormous significance was likely killed or captured in Northumbria around 865 AD. The Anglo-Saxon sources record unusual Norse aggression toward Northumbria shortly after, an aggression so massive, so coordinated, so catastrophically powerful, that it suggests a motive beyond mere raiding. Revenge. Sons avenging a father. King Alla of Northumbria was reportedly executed by the Great Heathen Army using the blood eagle, a brutal, ritualistic killing. Was this revenge for Ragnar? The timing is almost too perfect to ignore. Real or mythological, the death of Ragnar Lothbrok functions as something specific in history. A trigger, a spark, the ignition point of one of the most devastating military campaigns in Dark Ages Europe. And the men who lit that fire were his sons. We promised you the sons. Lap 7 is where history definitely happens. Now, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ubba, Sigurd Snake in the Eye. 5 names that should make every medieval historian's heart beat faster. Because unlike their father, these men are real, documented, undeniable, in the historical record with extraordinary clarity. And in 865 AD, 1 year possibly after their father's death, they arrived on the coast of East Anglia with a force the Anglo-Saxon chronicle called the Great Heathen Army, the largest Viking invasion force England had ever seen. The Great Heathen Army did not come to raid. It came to conquer. And the man who led its most devastating campaigns was the most mysterious of Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless. Ivar the Boneless, a name that has fascinated and baffled historians for over 1,000 years. What does boneless mean? Theories range from a condition like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which causes hypermobility of joints, to a kenning, a poetic nickname meaning the flexible, referring to his tactical agility. Some suggest it was a sexual insult from enemies. Others that it referred to extraordinary physical flexibility. Whatever it meant, the man was terrifying. The Anglo-Saxon sources describe him as the primary architect of the Great Heathen Army's strategy, a leader of almost supernatural tactical intelligence. The man who would, in 866, capture York, the second city of England, who would divide the English kingdoms against each other, who would execute King Alla. The Blood Eagle. The most debated execution method in Viking history. Did it really happen? Scholars argue fiercely. The sources that describe it were written centuries later. But one fact is undeniable. Whatever Ivar did to Alla was catastrophic enough that Anglo-Saxon writers recorded it with a horror that leaps off the vellum 1,000 years later. We keep returning to revenge, to the sons avenging the father. This loop is intentional, because it is the loop of history, the pattern that repeats. Ragnar begat sons who begat a legend that begat a nation. The Great Heathen Army is not legend. It is documented history, archaeological confirmation, In 2018, a mass burial site at Repton in Derbyshire, long known to historians, was definitively confirmed through radiocarbon dating and isotope analysis. Over 260 bodies, Viking warriors, dating to the 870s, the winter quarters of the Great Heathen Army, preserved in the earth. These were Ragnar's sons' men, real bones, real warriors, real evidence that the saga was rooted, however loosely, in genuine history. The army did something no Viking force had done before. It wintered. It stayed. It wasn't raiding, it was occupying. The difference between a raid and a conquest is whether you go home. The Great Heathen Army did not go home. By 874, the army had destroyed Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. 3 of England's 4 kingdoms had fallen. Only Wessex remained. And standing between the Vikings and total conquest of England, a young king named Alfred. Alfred the Great. A man who, in the winter of 878, was reduced to hiding in the Somerset marshes, a fugitive in his own kingdom. The story of Ragnar's sons almost ends English civilization as we know it. Almost. Alfred's survival, his counter-campaign, his creation of the Danelaw, his transformation into England's greatest king, is one of history's most dramatic reversals. But it would not have existed without the pressure that created it, without the Great Heathen Army, without Ragnar's sons, without Ragnar. A man who may not have existed caused a king who definitely existed to create a country that definitely exists. The mythology shaped the reality. The legend changed the world. And this is the heart of it. Not whether Ragnar was real, but what his story did. What a name can do. What a legend can cause. The Icelandic sagas, written between 1200 and 1400 AD, some of the most extraordinary documents in human history. Not merely stories, but an entire civilization's attempt to remember itself, to preserve the names and deeds of ancestors who lived by a code that said, the only true immortality is to be remembered. The saga tradition was oral first. For 3 to 5 centuries, stories about Ragnar circulated as spoken performance in the long halls of Norse chieftains, around fires in Iceland, on ships crossing the North Atlantic. When they were finally written down, they were already layered with centuries of embellishment, addition, and poetic license. But here is what scholars have found. Embedded in the embellishment, like insects in amber, are fragments of genuine historical memory. Details so specific, so oddly practical, that they couldn't have been invented. The pitch-covered armor. The use of specific river routes for raids that match actual Viking navigation patterns. The political tensions between Danish and Norwegian factions within the army, tensions that archaeology now confirms were real. The naming of specific English kings who were real, who did rule when the sagas say they ruled. The sagas got more right than we gave them credit for. For a long time, historians treated them like fairy tales. Then, archaeologists kept finding the fairy tales underground. Troy was a myth, until Schliemann dug it up. The wood near Agincourt was legendary, until historians mapped it. The legendary Ragnar's sons were myths, until their winter camp at Repton yielded 260 skeletons. Wind over an open field. The silence of discovery. The lesson of the 20th century in archaeology is this: do not dismiss the myths. Listen to them. They are encoded memory. They are the past speaking in the only language it had, the language of story. Ragnar Lothbrok may be that language made flesh. a name that holds a generation's worth of history inside it. Not one man, but a generation of men. A symbol of an age. Which brings us to the question of what that symbol became. What it means now. In 2013, the television series Vikings brought Ragnar Lothbrok to a global audience of tens of millions. Travis Fimmel's portrayal, quiet, strange, philosophical, violent, became one of the defining TV performances of the decade. And something remarkable happened. Enrollment in Old Norse language courses spiked in universities across Europe and North America. Viking Age archaeological sites saw record visitor numbers. Publisher of academic works on the Norse world reported sales increases they'd never seen. A fictional Ragnar sparked a genuine hunger for the real one. And the hunger for the real Ragnar reveals something profound about why we need him. In an age of increasingly impersonal power, of distant institutions and faceless authority, there is something deeply human about the Viking ideal of the individual who shapes their own destiny by will alone. The descendants of the historical Norse expansion are everywhere. The Normans, who conquered England in 1066, who founded kingdoms in Sicily and Antioch, who shaped the modern French and English languages, were Norse in origin. The Rus, the founding people of Russia and Ukraine, were Norse traders and warriors who settled the river routes of Eastern Europe. Half of England has place names of Norse origin: Whitby, Scarborough, Grimsby. The B suffix is Old Norse for settlement. Every time you say Thursday, you say Thorsday. Every time you say Wednesday, Odin's Day, Woden. The Norse world did not disappear. It dissolved into the world we live in. It became the air we breathe. And at the center of that legacy, real or constructed, historical or mythological, stands the figure of Ragnar Lothbrok, laughing in the snake pit, sending his final message to sons who would burn half a continent in his name. One lap remaining. And the question we opened with, finally, its answer. We are exactly where we started, but changed. We began with a question. Did Ragnar Lothbrok exist? We have traveled 2 hours through myth and archaeology, through saga and DNA analysis, through death songs and battle maps. And now, the answer. The honest answer is, we don't know. Not with certainty. No birth record, no grave, no confirmed DNA, no coin with his face. The paper trail ends where the legend begins. And this is the piece of evidence we promised you in Lap 1, the overlooked fragment. There is a 9th century source that may change everything. The Annals of Saint-Bertin, a Frankish chronicle written contemporaneously, meaning in real time, in the 9th century. It records a Viking leader who raided the Seine in 845 AD. The name given in some manuscripts? Ragnarus, king of the Danes, commander of the Great Fleet. Ragnarus. Not Ragnar Lothbrok, the full saga name, but Ragnarus, a Latin rendering of the Norse name Ragnar, in a real document, written within living memory of the events it describes, describing deeds that match the Ragnar Lothbrok of saga precisely. This does not prove the Ragnar of the sagas existed as described, but it suggests strongly that there was a real Norse leader named something like Ragnar, who was extraordinary enough to be named in Frankish chronicles, powerful enough to demand ransom from an emperor, and famous enough that stories about him survived for 5 centuries of oral tradition until they were finally written down. In other words, Ragnar Lothbrok may be a composite, a mythological construction. a legend that accumulated deeds and attributes over centuries. But at the core of that legend, there is almost certainly a real man, a real Viking, a real force of nature who carved his name into the history of Europe with the edge of a sword. What didn't to see, that is enough. Perhaps more than enough. History does not require certainty to matter. The Trojan War may be partly mythological, and yet it shaped Western literature for 3,000 years. King Arthur may be legendary, and yet his story built an entire moral philosophy about leadership and sacrifice. Ragnar Lothbrok may be both man and myth, and yet he set in motion events that shaped England, France, Russia, Normandy, and the modern world. His sons were real. Their army was real. The bones at Repton are real. The Norse place names across northern England are real. The Danelaw was real. Alfred the Great, forged by the pressure of the Great Heathen Army, was real. And the man those sons said they were avenging was real enough to them to move mountains. The eyes able to Ragnar Lothbrok, the farmer who became a king, the raider who became a legend, the father whose death launched 1,000 ships, the man who laughed in the snake pit because he knew, even dying, that his story was only beginning. The Norse keeping about little pigs are still grunting. They always will be. Whose bones lie in the earth of England? Or perhaps nowhere at all?